Hello, everyone. I'm Carlos Carnicero Urabayen. I'm editor-in-chief of Future is Blue, the weekly economic affairs newsletter promoted by Funcas Europe and Agenda Pública. And today we're here to talk about the recovery plan presented by the Commission and the 7-year budget that will need still to be approved by all member states. So this is still to be seen how this agreement is going to look at in the end. And we're here today precisely to think about scenarios and to see how this deal will look like in the end. And we have 3 great analysts joining us. And we're joined by Karolina Ekholm, professor at Stockholm University and member of Bruegel's board. We are joined by Adriaan Schout, senior research fellow at Clingendael think tank. And last but not least, Raymond Torres, Funcas Europe director. So thank you for being with us. And the first question I have for you is, I'd like you to share with us, what's your view on the proposal of the Commission? Is this the right response to the COVID-19 economic crisis? Is this good enough? Is this strong enough considering how bad this crisis is? So maybe, Karolina, maybe you can start sharing your views with us.
I think it's a reasonable proposal. It's reasonable from the point of view of what is needed, but also considering all the restrictions that apply. Of course, you could wish for more things or different things, but ultimately the Commission needs to come up with something that is going to be palatable to a whole range of member states with different interests in this. So I think it's a reasonable proposal, and I think it's a reasonable starting point for negotiations. There isn't much there that could really upset anyone, and there's a sufficient amount of things that you can play around with in negotiations.
Okay, Adriaan, do you share that view? Is it reasonable? Do you see it as the right proposal in terms of how Karolina just described it?
Well, it's probably the basis of a compromise. That is something that we can count on one way or the other. We still need to know what it is about precisely, how it will work. One of the big dangers that we're having at the moment is that there's an awful lot of money going around now. First, there was the 500 billion package agreed, 500 billion agreed by the Eurogroup already earlier on. Now we have this package, so we have the MFF and we have the 750. So in all, it's really a lot of money, and we have to see what it will be spent on, and we have to make very sure that the way it will be spent is defendable also in the end, because it's too much money to think lightly about. So one of the key questions, I think, also for the Netherlands is precisely the whole governance of this project. And for example, one of the questions that there is if you look at this amount of money that is now going around also for the investments, what is the absorption capacity of these funds? And can that reasonably expected to be managed in a relatively short amount of time, let's say 3 years or so, at least, producing the plans and get it all set up and running. Those are risks of formidable size. And then in the background, there are discussions about, is this a one-off process, as it is being explained? On the other hand, this is about greening, digitalization, etc., industrial policy, this doesn't sound like a one-off process. Then you have questions about the whole funding of this. Where exactly does the funding come from, and is it even allowed to do it in this way with debts for the Commission? So it's a basis of compromise. It's risky, and there are many questions open at this stage. Personally, I'm not so clear about where Italy will stand in, let's say, September, when the PEP is well on its way. It may actually be that if growth will come back, Italy may be in the safest position. If growth doesn't come back and the PEP is running out, the whole discussion about this MFF may be put in a different light. So lots of question marks. Okay,
thank you, Adriaan. Lots of question marks indeed. Raymond, is it a good base? Do you agree with it's been said before?
Yes, in a way, I very much agree with Karolina and Adriaan. So I think it seems this group would be a good recipe for maybe later agreements, but what I want to say basically, in addition to what Karolina and Adriaan said, is that this kind of package is exactly what is needed. Given the nature of the shock, one should never forget that we're talking about a pandemic which has somehow paralyzed the European economy. I don't think there's any country spared by this shock. And in economic terms, among other things, what it means is that the private sector is in a position of simply not spending. Either because incomes have declined or enterprise closures, or because simply consumers or investors do not want to consume or invest. So in other words, all the projections actually are for, in the first signs that we already see, are for a very significant increase in private savings. So in other words, the private sector is not in a position either for direct impact of the crisis or because indirectly it simply does not want to spend, is not in a position to spend. So in a way, only let's say this is the time for fiscal policy. So in that sense, it seems to me it's the right approach. You could say, well, if it's the right time for fiscal policy, it could be country-specific fiscal policy. But there are two advantages of acting at the European-wide level. One is that certain issues, I think Adriaan said, certain projects it's obviously more efficient to conduct them on the European level, let's say technology or renewable energy, not to mention the medical sector. It makes sense to act together. And the second reason is that some countries are more affected than others. And we know from the financial crisis that if nothing is done, there can be a free fall of those economies to a low growth equilibrium, if you wish. And it's very difficult to recover afterwards. So it's in the interest of all countries that something is done not only at the country level, but also at the European level. And in terms of the flip side of the recovery fund, which has been proposed at the European level, which, as Karolina said, is still a proposal, I would say, it comes late. It would only be operational, provided there is an agreement, we still need to see, only from next year, and the funds would be dispersed, I suppose, only from the middle of next year. And in the meantime, there are many risks here involved. So clearly there is a time dimension. Adriaan said, for example, that September, what happens to Italy, I could add also to Spain. If there's no growth coming back in the third quarter, and certainly in the fourth quarter, then, we are in a completely different scenario. So there is a time dimension here. But that said, I believe it's a step in the right direction.
So time dimension. So this should be approved as soon as possible. I don't know how realistic is that. The leaders are planning to have a virtual summit in June, maybe another one in July to get the deal approved. So, but there obvious difficulties that you mentioned before. One of them is about the size, the amount of the money. Adriaan said this is a lot of money. The proposal was talking about 750 billion. It was also including mostly grants rather than loans, which was also controversial. So I want to ask you, going into details, how do you see an agreement emerging, considering what we know so far? So what kind of elements do you see as some, of course, we have Denmark, Austria, the Netherlands, and Sweden, who are the four most reluctant member states to this whole idea that we are discussing. So what kind of elements do you see as being critical for compromising? Maybe conditions attached to those grants, maybe reducing the size of that package, maybe talking more about the timeline of. So please, who wants to react to this dilemma and to this question? Caroline, do you want to start?
Yes, so one quite important aspect of this when it comes to Sweden, since Sweden is one of the frugal four, Sweden is one of these countries where EU policies are set by parliament and not by the government. I think it's Sweden and Finland. And that's quite important because I think a government is more, it has, maybe it's more prepared to do these trades in a negotiation. Parliament or the parliamentarians, they are more removed from EU negotiations, and they tend to stick to their guns, and that creates a certain type of dynamics for Swedish positions. So I think one has to interpret also the position of the Swedish government in view of this, because there's a very strong opposition in parliament against having a very large MFF, for instance, and not cut back on MFF in proportion to the loss of the UK in the European Union. And that is going to be a restriction on Sweden in these negotiations. There's a little bit of a danger, I think, with, the Commission has put together the MFF proposal with a recovery fund to link those two things, because that could, I think the position in Swedish Parliament is that they're not going to be in a hurry to make a deal on the MFF. The longer it goes on, the stronger the negotiation position. So that's a kind of a danger when it comes to the recovery fund. On the other hand, you might argue that we're now in a position where we're still in some sort of crisis management mode. At some point, we need to think about using fiscal policy as a macro policy instrument for recovery, but that it maybe is not sort of immediate concern. So maybe it's okay that it is a bit prolonged in time. But I think I see that as a danger. And if the feeling is that one needs to agree quickly, then obviously there has to be concessions made to the frugal four. That's how I would see it. And I completely agree with Adriaan, by the way, that I think there's too much focus on the overall number of how much is going to be spent. I think that's it's not a good focus. One should focus on what are we going to use this money for, and we discussed that way too little.
Adriaan, you mentioned before the issue of the management of the money and the amount of the money, and so what key aspects do you see as being critical for compromising?
Well, maybe not even the management of the funds, but the trust that there is in countries now finally reforming, because this is the second euro crisis in a bit more than a decade. And as it looks, the economics underlying patterns of the member states will not come out stronger out of this crisis. This is, first of all, a survival mode. It is of absolute essential in the whole debate that the doubts about the growth potential of member states is being removed. The trust has to come back. And if I take Italy, I'm sorry to say, the trust wasn't there in 1991, right at the start from the whole Euro project. And there was a big debate whether Italy should join. And Italy is now sort of the focal country here, and it is especially also with these funds now, the size. It is very important that Italy, but also other countries, display how they will reform their economies so that the growth potential comes back. Because, of course, the debt of Italy is a problem, for sure, but it's related to the growth of the economy, which has been rather stagnating for 20 years. That is the fundamental problem, and I expect that this question of the growth potential of member states will be fundamental for the political acceptance, also in the Netherlands, for this program. This program is dubious. I think it will be accepted, but this underlying trust pattern, that is the key for.
So that means like specific conditions for reforms in order to be able to.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if that will come back in the discussions. What is the situation of the labor markets, for example? Very important. What is the balance of the competitiveness indicators, education systems, whatever you can imagine? It is absolutely key that this solves the underlying competitiveness problem of the countries. This also has to do with judicial systems. It really goes to the institutions of the member states. I expect this will come back, and I do hope that the weak countries will start with these debates rather than wait for other countries to impose it, because that will just increase the heat, and it will spoil the atmosphere in the negotiations.
Raymond, what's your reaction to that?
Yes, I think that I think one of the conditions to get, because that was your question, Carlos, really to improve convergence between the different positions, seems to me to have a common understanding of the consequences of what is at stake. I think we're talking about, in a way, the very European integration project. That failure to address this problem now that we're having, caused by the pandemic, with the differentiated impacts, true, but still could put at risk the whole European integration project at a time when we have two other superpowers, the US and China, which are already moving very fast in certain directions. For example, in terms of technology or industrial policy. I'm not sure they're using the same tools as we do in Europe. And certainly it makes a lot of sense to have a common approach here on those issues in order to, also create a bit more. I mean, we need positive messages also in Europe. We have Brexit, and now we have a crisis, but certainly we have to look forward to the future. And I think this is part of it. I mean, the European integration project, there is the single market, which could be at risk if we are not careful. While we talk, we have differentiated state aid. Some countries are giving a lot of state aid and promoting competitiveness of enterprises, in a way seizing the opportunity of the fact that the single market is in parentheses, some of the rules are not really fully applied. But beyond Europe, also, as I said, vis-à-vis US and China. So I think it's very important to look at the consequences of disagreeing among ourselves. It could be quite significant. The second condition to get closer to an agreement, and I think the first one involves all countries, has to be, and I'm sure in the very end, we will have to see. I mean, in Sweden, the whole parliament will have to decide, from what I understand, but in every country, as a de facto, and so we have to see what public opinions think. But certainly, this is one of the conditions, that public opinions understand what is at stake. The second condition has to do with the countries which are facing a particularly difficult situation. They have also a particular responsibility of undertaking some of the reforms which were not done fully before. Well, in the case of Spain, where I am sitting now, I think that there has been quite a bit of a reform effort, but not fully, I agree. And I would say the same goes with frugal countries. I mean, there is also, if you look at the recommendations by the European Commission, there is also recommendations there. So I think all countries have a bit to do, but certainly in the case of high-debt countries, it's particularly important in the present circumstances, so I would say. And I will add to this that reforms should not be equated with austerity policies. I mean, there was a certain notion of reforms that this would necessarily mean more austerity and, in a way, wider inequalities. Well, we have learned quite a lot from reform experiences in Europe that you can reform countries while maintaining a welfare state, which is a decent welfare state, and also not aggravating inequalities. It's a question of policy design. I mean, it's not the time now to go into the details, but it's a bit of a condition for the European Commission itself to relay that notion. So,
thank you, Raymond. Before, we don't have a lot of time, but maybe I'd like to ask you a final reaction on how to bridge North and South divisions, because this is not the first time we're seeing this kind of debate. And of course, when we don't have common action, fast action in a timely manner, we are losing a lot. And Raymond mentioned the competence from China and the US, but even inside, we have a very severe problem. We need to act fast and united. So maybe you can have a final word on how to bridge North and South divisions for the next crisis, hopefully, so we have a more common understanding of what's at stake. Who wants to react to this one to finish?
Well, maybe I can start. I mean, obviously, this is a very difficult question. I mean, there are different traditions and practices in these countries, and I think ultimately there has to be a give and take from both sides, obviously, to keep together sort of the larger group. And I mean, I have, of course, apart from now being an academic, I have a past as being a government official. So I've been sitting in these EU committees debating the Stability and Growth Pact and the European semester for many years. And it's very repetitive because positions are completely set and they are just being repeated over and over again. I mean, personally, I would see the need to create structures where the member states have some sort of room to pursue things their own way without that being a threat to the whole structure. Of course, that's easy to say when you're Swedish because we're not part of the Eurozone, which of course creates restrictions for the Eurozone countries that you don't have when you have your own currency. But I really think that that there's been, at least regarding the Stability and Growth Pact and the European semester, there's too much, too strong attempts to put everyone in the same mold and have one size fits all. And I don't think that that's ever going to work. But I also think it is important for, in order to not destroy the monetary union, to ensure that the construction doesn't just exacerbate these regional divergences that you tend to see.
All right, thanks. Adriaan.
Carlos, I think it's not a matter of bridging the gap, because the division between the countries is enormous, and underneath these political divisions, there are huge differences in the institutional capabilities. Yet we're all in the euro, and this is just a sort of pain that has to live itself out. It has to be some sort of process. There will be a compromise, but that will not be the end of the process. The situation is really worrying, as I said, precisely because of the trust is very low. We see this trust also, coming back in the sort of open hatred. The Netherlands is being called a repulsive country, for example. People talk also about the frugal four, whereas here in the Netherlands we have a debate: should it not be called the wise four, or the four that pursued not a frugal policy but counter-cyclical policy? So it's this terminology that is rather unhelpful at the moment. We need reforms. There will be conditionality discussions. This will all be political debates, and we need these political debates. One thing I would add is that the EU, the Eurozone, has to ask itself the question: how come the original ideas behind the euro have not been lived up to? And here there's some thorny homework to do for the European Commission in terms of the way how it has managed the semester and pursued its role as a monitoring and enforcing of the system and the objectives behind it. It is very clear that is one of the very serious difficulties that we now have. There was a 60% state debt rule. Look where we are. We cannot have this situation without a discussion about the reliability of the Commission. Also because now it wants to claim, with this enormous new amounts of money, again a very central role. So the Commission also has a trust issue at the moment, which I'm looking forward to the debates that we will have about the Commission and its own role, also in the new funds, but also in the supervision of aiming at convergence.
Raymond, do you want to have final word before we close?
Yes, maybe because it's the final, I will try to put a bit of a more positive tone and say that, it's true that these issues were there before, but I think Euro faced before different crises, and some of them much worse than the present one. And so I think the memory is still fresh, the different types of crises that we face, that we know that we can overcome them. And I think if you look at the history of Euro, it's possible to overcome them when you focus on the really important issues. In a way, I would agree with both Karolina and Adriaan by saying that somehow we've been lost a bit in the details. And we did not focus enough on the priorities of the union. I think maybe in Europe we try to do too many things in too much detail, whereas maybe we should have focused much more on the key issues which could not be done at the country level. The second thing is that rather than there has been, this should also go hand in hand with some conditionalities, but the conditionality seems to me should be more in terms of outcomes rather than going into the nitty-gritty of the policy details. I don't think it's up to the European Commission or any particular European body to monitor and put conditions on the specific policy dimension, the way you shape policies, because each country is different. And for example, an area I know relatively well, which is social protection, is really very different across countries. So trying to harmonize to have the same approach to social protection, which is a big chunk of public money, seems to me impossible. So instead, focus on the outcomes, on the key outcomes, and just focus on this. And I've read myself, I'm sure my colleagues as well, the different rules which make up for the growth, the Stability and Growth Pact. If you add the different regulations which form the Stability and Growth Pact, is really tens and tens of pages. It's almost impossible, except for a young person who applies for a job, to remember so much. And this shows that it just goes too much into the details instead of focusing on the key outcomes. And that's a very important issue. And finally, again, I think it's very important to remember what is at stake. And we are at a very important geopolitical juncture with the United States and China, a reconfigured globalization process and a multilateral system which needs to be rebuilt. And I don't think any country, neither the WISE 4 nor the other EU countries, can do that on their own. I think it's only acting together that we will manage to contribute to this.
All right. I think I would keep talking to you for longer. This is very interesting, but unfortunately we need to leave it here. I'm not sure we solved the whole question, but I'm sure we had a good debate, and we raised the topics that are there on the agenda and that are more difficult to solve. So hopefully we'll keep talking about this, and hopefully we'll see a deal soon. And I want to thank you for joining the Future is Blue video talk, and talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.